We all want to get better at Yu-Gi-Oh! In some form or another. As much fun as this game is, at the end of the day when it comes down to it, nobody likes to lose, but sometimes we attribute those losses to things that might seemingly be out of our control. Well, what if I told you that not only are those things in your control, but also could make the difference between a win or a loss? Today I'm bringing to you my top 5 reasons why you are still losing at Yu-Gi-Oh! Number 5, reading the card. Whoa, fuck me, reading? You know that thing you were taught to do when you were 5 years old? Yeah, reading can actually help determine whether or not you win or lose a game.
I can't read.
Now I know, it's reading. No one really likes reading when it comes down to it. I mean, hell, you look at a card like Astrograph Sorcerer, look how much fucking text is on this card, and not to mention, it's microscopically printed on this piece of cardboard, meaning you need a fucking microscope to even read it, so the fact that not only you have to read the text, but there's so much of it, just makes it completely intimidating, and what happens is one of two things. Either you let your opponent tell you what the card does, or you go based off prior recollection of playing against the card before, hoping you remember enough to be able to proceed forward. But there's an inherent flaw with both of those instances. The first instance, if you let your opponent tell you what the card does, they may conceal some of the other effects of that card, because maybe in the certain instance that the card is being used, only one of its many effects actually need to be applied, so they're only going to tell you that specific aspect of it. If you don't read the card, that's not their responsibility, that's yours. And in the second instance, you know, if you are just going based off prior recall, again, it's the same issue where you might not remember everything that the card does, meaning you might fall into something and play into something your opponent might want you to, and then you're going to put yourself in an incredibly bad situation, all because you didn't read the card. So basically what it boils down to is, if you don't know what the card does, take a moment and read it. Number 4, understanding interactions. Two of the most common phrases you'll hear at any Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament, whether it's a locals, a regionals, or even a YCS for that matter, is either I misplayed or I didn't know how that worked. And those are two very big things that are in our control. If you misplayed, that means that you didn't understand how certain interactions were going to be working, whether it was in your sequencing of how you were proceeding with playing out your cards, or if your cards and your opponent's cards were interacting with one another in a specific way, maybe because of your unfamiliarity with maybe your opponent's cards or maybe the matchup or a wide variety of different things, then basically because you didn't know and could predict the outcome of how that interaction was going to play out, it's left you at a disadvantageous position. And ultimately, that's something we can control by understanding, especially when you're at a competitive event, there's only a small card pool that's actually being used. Now, the more defined a format is, the less decks that are more likely to be at the top of the format, meaning there's only going to be so many cards that people are using. So the best way to alleviate this is to understand all the different cards that are in a specific format. Hell, if it's a local format, maybe you've got that one player that's playing something completely out of left field, but they beat you because you don't understand what you're going up against. If you take the time to understand how your cards in the deck that you're playing interact with not only other cards in your deck, but also the decks that you might be potentially playing against in certain matchups, that's how you can not only avoid misplaying, but understanding how card interactions work. Number 3, if I had one more turn. I cannot tell you how many fucking times I hear someone at a tournament, even in a locals or just like a casual event, say this phrase. I think this is one of the most scapegoatish-like phrases that you could possibly use to not put the blame so much on yourself, but rather something that might be out of your control. But I think that's something that a lot of people need to uncondition themselves from, because this is something that could be potentially avoided. Now, rather than focusing on something that didn't happen, in this case, one turn that never seemed to come up, focus on what did happen. When you're playing a game or a match and you think to yourself, if I had one more turn, think about the events that transpired over the course of that game, or even that match if it went down to the very end. Think about when you played certain cards, or when you were presented with a situation where you had several lines of play, but you chose to go with one line of play when you had other options in front of you. You know, maybe you used that Raigeki a little bit too early and should have saved it for a turn or two when your opponent managed to build a bigger board against you, and the Raigeki was not only going to get more value off of itself, but also going to put you in the more advantageous position. There's a lot of different interactions, especially over the course of a game or even a match, that ultimately determine whether or not there is a winner or a loser. And if you take the time to reflect back on those instances, it not only helps you grow as a player because it helps you look through a different lens at what you could have done differently by giving yourself a more critical review of your play, but it's going to show when you play into your matches moving forward because you've taken that time, understood the mistakes you've made in the past, and determined that you're not going to make those mistakes again in the future. Number 2, all archetypes are not created equally. Now, this is the point in the video where I have to tell you your Dark Scorpion Turbo deck is nowhere nearly as powerful nor consistent as a deck like Necroz or Zodiac. It's the sad reality of the game, but with the way that power creep works and how it's implemented, all archetypes are not created equally. Think of all archetypes on a spectrum, with the x-axis being power and the y-axis being consistency. Now, if you have decks like Necroz and Zodiac that are extremely powerful and extremely consistent, they're going to be on the higher end of that spectrum. And then basically you can start to populate decks and understand, well, this deck is super consistent, but what does it really produce on the board? Or vice versa, this deck is super powerful by being able to just produce just an amazingly powerful boss monster, but how consistently can I produce that boss monster, especially in a competitive setting? These are things you all need to think about, because when you're playing in a competitive setting, sometimes by playing the stronger deck, you inherently have an advantage over if you were playing a deck that is weaker, because even though you're playing a deck that, let's say, it's not your favorite deck, the thing is, because you're playing an inherently stronger deck, it pretty much will carry you because of the fact that the card quality of the individual cards is stronger than something than you would be saying like in your Dark Scorpion deck, or the consistency is there because you're seeing the combo pieces you want to see much more often than hoping you would be drawing them straight off the top of your deck. So ultimately the lesson is here. Sometimes people don't want to play a different archetype because they're so just in love with a certain archetype, but when they try to play it, they realize that they keep getting stomped 9 times out of 10. And yes, theoretically, any deck can beat any deck, but at the same time, you have to realize if you're playing an inherently stronger deck, then naturally you're going to have a better chance to win than strictly whether or not you're playing a worse deck. Number 1, putting in the time. Now, putting in the time pretty much applies to every other point that we discussed in this video so far. By putting in the time and playing lots of different matches against lots of different decks, depending on whatever the meta may be in, whether your locals, your regionals, YCS, whatever it may be, by putting in the time, you're not only going to be more familiar with the cards you're going to be going up against, meaning you're not going to need to read them as often, and you might not misplay or not understand specific interactions with how your cards interact with your opponents. You're going to not basically regret that you didn't have that one extra turn, because you're going to know that you maximized every single play to the best potential. And lastly, you understand that the deck you're playing is the deck for you, because you've play tested so many different decks and you've come to the conclusion that based off of all of my analysis, this is the deck that I want to play for this event for these reasons, and this is the reason why I should do well. Ultimately, by putting in the time, it's the biggest form of time commitment, because you need to go attend locals. You need to take the time to play these games out. Sometimes games can take anywhere from 30, 40, even 50 minutes, especially if you're playing in a more casual setting where the time isn't as enforced as rigorously as it might be in a larger tournament. But ultimately what it boils down to is, if you put in the time, practice makes picks perfect, and you're going to be conditioning yourself and getting on your way to become a better player. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.
1, 2, 3, 4.